title of this training is Understanding and Helping a Suicidal Person. And we're going to be talking about some ways to intervene in a suicidal situation and just talking about the wisdom of intervening in general. Suicide is probably the most preventable form of death. And knowing how to intervene and knowing that it's okay to intervene is probably the most important variable as to whether a suicide will be completed or not. It's important to understand some things about people who want to kill themselves. What we're dealing with here usually is someone who is in a great deal of pain, usually emotional pain, or it could be physical and emotional, and that he or she can see no other option. The goal of the behavior, the goal of suicide, is to stop the pain. And they don't see another way to do that. However, the will to live is a very strong thing, a very persistent thing, even with people who are suicidal. So I'm going to tell you about a study that was done, and I would imagine this would be a pretty gruesome study to participate in, but they did a study of people. They surveyed a large group of people who had attempted suicide by jumping off a bridge but did not die. They jumped off the bridge and survived. And they interviewed these people. And the interesting statistic here is that 100% of them reported that they changed their mind on the way down. The will to live is a very strong thing. And almost everyone who is suicidal is at least a little bit ambivalent, and sometimes greatly ambivalent and conflicted about ending their own lives. It's pain, it's not seeing another option, and wanting the pain to end. So some things to bear in mind about helping. It's important to take it seriously. When you encounter someone who talks about wanting to take their lives, you need to take it seriously, stay calm, and do not over or under react. People get very anxious sometimes about using the quote-unquote right words. It's really not that important. If you are concerned as a human being for them, your voice and manner will show it. And one of the most important things you can help a person do in a suicidal situation is to let them vent, let them unload. Let them show and talk about the despair and the anger and the anguish that they're going through. That often, just that act of venting often results in improving the mood and state of the person. A suicidal crisis is often a very short duration. If we can intervene right as the crisis starts or during the crisis, usually suicidal people don't stay acutely suicidal for a long time. That can happen, but usually the crisis is a matter of hours, not a matter of days or weeks. There's a concept that we often talk about. We talk about the concept of, yes, suicide is spoken here. By staying calm and not overreacting, we communicate the message to the other person that we are comfortable with them talking to us about this topic. If we react with a lot of anxiety, if we get panicked, if they detect in us that we are very uncomfortable with this topic, then sometimes what happens to the suicidal person is they kind of shut down or won't tell you much. And we'll talk about some ways to sort of not let that kind of message get out. But one of the best ways to do that is the use of direct language. If you're dealing with a person and they seem to be in great emotional pain, the most important thing to do is to ask the question. And asking the question in as direct a way as possible. One of the mistakes that we sometimes see people make in these situations is they euphemize the suicide. They sort of put it in couched or covered up or disguised terms, such things as, are you thinking of hurting yourself? Are you thinking of doing something stupid? Do I have to worry about you? That kind of thing. a couple of problems with that, and the number one problem is it communicates our own discomfort with the topic. If I can't ask the question directly, it means I'm not comfortable with the topic. And if the person picks up the fact that I'm not comfortable with the topic, they're probably not going to talk to me about it. So be willing to put it right on the line. Are you thinking of killing yourself? Are you thinking of ending your life? Are you having thoughts about suicide? I've heard people say to me, wouldn't that give them the idea? You know, if someone's in great despair, that idea is already there. You're not giving it to them. But what you are doing is giving them permission to talk about it and telling them that they can talk to you about it. So one of the most important things is to get comfortable asking the question. Suicidal people want to talk. Most of the time they want to talk. They want to vent. Now, as you talk about this thing, you start to ask questions about the intention, about and in psychological terms, we call this a lethality assessment. There's a continuum here. Having thoughts about ending your life. If that's all that's happening, the person is having thoughts, certainly it's something to take seriously, but that's the only thing that's going on, I think we can assume that most intelligent people, at least once in a while in their lives, have those thoughts, and they're not necessarily dangerous, but they certainly need to be paid attention to. If thoughts then, move on to become intentions, now we're at a different level of lethality. If intentions then go on to become plans, again, it's a much more dangerous situation. And then we actually start to think, so it goes from thoughts, I'd like to not be alive anymore, to intentions, I'm thinking I'm going to end my life, and plans, I want to do it Tuesday, and now means or methods. They've gone so far as the thought of think about how they're going to do it. And they have access to the means and the method. That's when you know a suicidal threat is quite lethal. If somebody tells you they're going to jump off a mountain, but they live in Florida, they're going to have to go drive a long way to get to a mountain. If somebody says they're going to shoot themselves, but they don't have a gun and they don't have a way to get a gun, so that's what I mean about access to the means. If somebody says, I'm going to shoot myself and I have the gun in the backseat of my car right now and I'm going to do it on Tuesday at 10 o'clock, that's a very lethal situation. So in the intervention, what needs to happen is asking the question. Do not be afraid to ask the question. A couple other things to keep in mind in this conversation. One of the most important things you can do in this conversation is let the person talk more than you do. You don't want to argue or judge. You don't want to make the person justify their intention to suicide. In fact, consider this. There is absolutely nothing wrong with wanting pain to go away. It's perfectly natural. Anyone who's in a great deal of agony wants that agony to go away, and that's a very rational thing to want. So we don't need to make people justify that. The point that we can make at some point in the conversation is that the solution they're proposing may be a little too much solution for the size of the problem. They sometimes refer to this as a permanent solution to a temporary problem. But arguing or judging is, again, it sort of betrays that we have some sort of discomfort with this topic, that we disapprove. I think it's perfectly okay to say to somebody, I want you to stay alive. I want you to stay alive. I want you to still be here. But one of the things they train interveners to never do is to say to somebody like, well, what about your children? Especially to a parent. I think you can assume, to a mom, let's say, you can assume that a person who's suicidal is probably not feeling very good about themselves. And if you add on by saying, you're also a rotten parent for thinking, you sort of achieve the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. The most important skill in intervening with a suicidal person is empathy, acknowledging the feelings. And empathy is a very simple communication technique. People sometimes overcomplicate it, and it is a very powerful communication technique. A lot of times when people are very distressed, very upset, or in a great deal of anguish, one of the things that drives and increases the anguish is their belief that no one gets it. No one knows what I'm going through. And that's where empathy comes in. So to practice empathy means there are two steps. One, pick up the feelings that the other person is communicating or showing, and then tell the person what you picked up. Empathy is easier than trying to fix what's wrong. You don't have to fix anything. You can say to somebody, here's an example of an empathic statement. I can see and feel how much pain you're in. That's all you have to do. You don't have to talk them out of the pain. You don't have to tell them it's not that big a deal. You don't have to solve it. You simply say, I get it. I can see how much pain you're in. I can feel how angry you are. I can hear how sad you are. I can look at your face and see the sadness. Those are empathic statements. And as soon as you do that, once you communicate in that way, you have stopped the loneliness of that anguish. And done right, what happens with empathy is the person gets a sense of relief. Somebody finally gets it. And sometimes that's all it takes to take a person out of a suicidal crisis. Somebody gets it. So empathy requires a couple of things. It requires that we not talk too much. It requires that we don't ask a lot of questions. Asking a lot of questions, how long have you been feeling this way? When did this start? Did you ever feel this way before? All of a sudden a bunch of rapid-fire questions feels like an interrogation, and it also feels like the person, they don't feel like they're being listened to, or that they're being attended to like a person, like a human being. We call that fact-centered listening as opposed to person-centered listening. Empathy is person-centered listening. You don't ask what they're feeling. You tell them what you pick up. I can see how sad you are. I can hear how angry you are. All right. Don't promise confidentiality to a suicidal person. You may have to call in the cavalry. And when I say call in the cavalry, I mean you may have to notify an emergency personnel, an ambulance, a police officer. Somebody may have to come and bring this person to a hospital or a mental health clinic, even if they don't want to go in a suicidal crisis. Getting help. Get the person to agree to that. As much as you can, get that person to make a commitment to you that they will, in fact, go see somebody and get some help, and then make that happen. If you're likely to encounter suicidal people in a repeated way in the work that you do, it may be helpful to have a little file on hand where you know where people can get help, and you know the numbers and the phone number and the directions and the addresses of places where people can get help. But they're not going to agree to do that until you've done the empathy piece. Empathy is not sympathy. Sympathy is a sort of a, oh, you poor thing kind of reaction. And sometimes sometimes the result of sympathy is the person feels even worse. Empathy is a little bit more detached. It's a sort of, I get what I'm not going through it, but I get what you're going through, and I'm here for you. And again, short statements, very quick, and allow the person to have, quote unquote, the stage as much as possible. Some misconceptions about suicide. People who talk about suicide won't do it. That is a misconception. Most people who attempt suicide tell at least somebody, and usually they tell more than one person. Suicidal people are, quote unquote, crazy. Let's talk about that a little bit. Certainly mental illness is a factor, and particularly depression. One of the factors that affects how dangerous a suicidal crisis is how accessible services are. For example, here in southern New England, we have a lot of mental health resources available to people, and we have a very low suicide rate compared to other parts of the country. Go out west on some of the Native American reservations or out in that area where people have to drive 150 miles to get to a clinic, and suicidal crises are much more lethal. They happen, they go to completion much more quickly. If someone is determined to suicide, nothing will stop them. This is patently false. Most people who are suicidal, the vast, vast majority of them, are ambivalent about it. The will to live is very strong, and they're hoping, there is some part of them that is hoping something will happen to make them not do what they're considering to do. So talking about suicide, getting a conversation going, connecting with another human being is often all it takes to end the crisis. That's why you make a point of not being afraid to ask the question. Get a dialogue going about that topic. And this other one, talking about suicide, may give somebody the idea that, again, is a very false misunderstanding and misconception about suicide. If people are in great despair, they're already thinking about suicide, and talking about it gives them permission to do that with you. Now, some risk factors. Very interesting gender breakouts here, because women attempt suicide twice as often as men do. However, men, quote unquote, succeed at suicide at a rate of 4 times greater than women. So women attempt it more often, but men actually complete it more often. And some of the reason for that is that when men select a method by which to kill themselves, they often select a very violent method. And it takes a lot to kill a human body, and usually it takes a lot of violence. Often the attempts that women make are made sort of medication, overdose, and that kind of thing. And those sorts of methods are reversible and stoppable much more effectively than, you know, shooting yourself in the head or driving into a bridge abutment. The greatest risk group is older men. They're at greater risk than younger men. Women, in terms of the lifespan, women are at the greatest risk of suicide between the ages of 45 and 54. Other risk factors, like any behavior, if there's a past history of attempts, once someone has broken that barrier and they've gone ahead and tried to kill themselves, most of us will never do that because we have a sort of barrier against that sort of behavior. But once someone's already broken that barrier, they can go down that road again. And so if you can find out if they've had a past history of attempts, it helps to assess the lethality of the risk at that time. And a past family history of suicide. My dad, my mom, my uncle, my grandfather, my brother. So, you know, if it was good enough for dad, it's good enough for me, that kind of thing. So these are all things to try to find out in the process, or if you can't find out right from the person, that you can find out from either a record or from an involved other person. And one of the most important things to do is make sure you get help. Additional information on this, you can contact Coastline Employee Assistance Program. Our phone numbers are on the bottom of the slide, 800-445-1195, and please feel free to call us anytime about these about questions about suicidality and intervening in a suicidal situation. We hope this was instructive, but again, feel free to call if there's any further information you'd like to get.